Okay?
What?
Yeah. Okay, so before we get right into this, just a thing on books, because as you might expect in this field, there are some really good ones, and there's a lot of ones that aren't. And sometimes it's hard to know which. The key one for me, anyway, was written by a Nobel Prize winner, Venki Ramakrishnan, here, Why We Die. He won a Nobel Prize for figuring out how mRNA is translated into proteins. So he follows in a very strong tradition. And he's 70. I would guess this book now is a bit of a turning his skills into examining aging. And it's actually a very good read, but there it is. You can pass it around. I underline books, make notes of them all the time, so don't be disturbed. That's what I do. So anyone who wants to look at it or pass it on, is good. Yeah, yeah, maybe not close that entirely.
I'm going to close it just a bit.
And then it runs this, one other. It's interesting that major healthcare institutions like the Mayo Clinic and Harvard and other systems are big into the publishing business. They even have their own publishing houses. And that's fairly new. So they're obviously courting the public, which means they respond to the public, which means they sometimes get into stuff that they really don't have much expertise in. But sometimes they do really, really good things. And one of them, I just mentioned this, looking after people with Alzheimer's disease or other dementias is not an easy thing for family, for friends, for staff. And every once in a while you run across a gem. And this is Angelica Lund from the Mayo Clinic. Day-to-day living with dementia. If you read this, it's pretty obvious that she's had a lot of experience talking to people, being with people, and has a really good feel for the disease and its impact on people. So it's a real gem. Then they come out with their kind of larger book from the same place, the Mayo Clinic, on dementia and Alzheimer's disease. And in one case, she's a co-author. Well, she's the best part of that book. And so I just mentioned that, so you might just pass that around. And then sometimes you run into a lot of books like this by Stephen Grundry on the longevity paradox, how to die young at a ripe old age, meaning you're really good right up to the end. And you have a longer life. There's not a lot of point in living to 120 if the last 30 years is miserable. So, but it's, in my view, it's kind of flaky. And it has a lot of company. So you have to be careful about what you read, I think. At least I was, or tried to be. So this is in 4 weeks, not the usual 6. And it's going to jump around a little bit because the subject requires me to jump around a little bit. So let's, one thing I would like to do is, there's a lovely piece that was in the New York Times by a couple of my favorite people, David Brooks and Gail Collins. Does that ring a bell for you people? Yeah. And certainly David Brooks, but Gail too. So this is the back and forth between the two of them. And the conversation starts out with David Brooks saying, well, Gail, have you started planning for your retirement? I mean, personal planning. What sort of public image do you want to project as you prepare to shake off this mortal coil? Well, then they get into this kind of thing. They start talking about Oliver Sacks. I didn't know it at the time, but there were several articles. I mean, he wrote this magnificent gem of a book, Gratitude. I mean, it's only about 50 pages long. It's a little thing. It's jam-packed, it's beautifully written and felt. And that book was split up into smaller essays.
Excuse me.
And yeah, here's, thanks. Yeah, thank you, Donna.
You're
Yeah.
welcome.
So there's gratitude. What a gem of a book. So we'll pass that around. Good to get it. Just well written and well lived. Here's another one. Gray Matters. This is a book written by a neurosurgeon about neurosurgery. So for me, this is living stuff. I knew a lot of them. And some of them I actually know in this book. One interesting thing here is that he talks about Joe Biden's 2 aneurysms and the care of the aneurysms. And it turns out that the surgeon who operated on him was actually trained in London Health Sciences by Charlie Drake. And Charlie, at his best, was probably one of the top 4 neurosurgeons in the world. And down in London, Ontario. Go figure. And he had superb judgment. The book, is it a great gem of writing? No. Does it tell a very good story of the culture of neurosurgery, of the difficulties of becoming a neurosurgeon? 6 to 7 years of training, plus, beyond medical school. Very, very demanding call, which hasn't let up even now. And so it's a good read, at least it's a good read for me, and it might be a good read for you. They do deal with life and death stuff all the time. Aneurysm surgery, the mortality rate is around 50%. So they see a lot of death. And they see a lot of morbidity or bad things go worse. So it comes through in their experience and the way that they kind of deal with it. Some not so well, and some a lot better. Well, back to David Brooks here and this thing. And to Oliver Sacks. Now, David says, Sacks described life at our age as a life of freedom. He portrayed a certain style of being old, which we might call dying with your boots on. And this is a quote from Oliver Sacks. When my time comes, I hope I can die in harness, as Francis Crick, Watson and Crick, as Crick did. When he was told that his colon cancer had returned at first, he said nothing. He simply looked into the distance for a minute and then resumed his previous train of thought. When pressed about his diagnosis a few weeks later, he said, whatever has a beginning must have an ending. When he died at 88, he was still fully engaged in his most creative work. Well, it wasn't creative, it was unconsciousness, and it was actually nothing but work. But was he working and feeling good about it? Yes, right up to the end. Now, the other idea about dying on the job, so to speak, there was a newspaper in New York, and the person who did the theater and play reviews had a pacemaker and all of a sudden died. Well, it took the newspaper all of an hour to get Gail on her way home to drop into a couple of theaters to pick up after he left. So there wasn't much to do about him, unfortunately. I love this one. The senior fitness nut. I've written elsewhere about people, this is David, about people who hit 80 and decide that since they have succeeded at everything else they ever did, they will now proceed to simply not die. They hire teams of fitness trainers, they pop Cialis like breath mints, and they enter ultramarathons. When they pass by you, they have shrunken down to 90 pounds of spandex-covered muscle and wrinkle. It's like confronting a little iron raisinette. Isn't that gorgeous? I love it, yeah. So, but I think the last one, David suggests, well, what about the biblical model spend the years between 80 and say 140 arguing with God, leading various peoples across the desert, producing many offspring and becoming known throughout time as a holy prophet. Of course, you've got to have connections in high places. That's David Gale. This appears to be a model that only works for men. Where I got my youthful religious training, the highest aspiration for a female was the title Virgin Martyr. Already missed the boat on that one. So there we are. That's into it, and so we'll have a little fun here, hopefully, as we work our way through this. Well, where's my... Well, Rembrandt. Rembrandt painted himself at least 90 times in his lifetime. And so I deliberately picked 3 because he's looking in the same direction. And I changed or boxed the pictures so they're more or less the same. They're not quite the same, you can't quite do that. But there he is at the age of 23. Not a wrinkle in sight. And not that kind of little pouty open mouth, but anyway. Well, here he is, 36, and my idea of 36-year-olds is this, for people in their mid-30s. This fellow's looking older, for sure. And in fact, he looks, if I was told he was in his early 50s, I might buy that. At least for what we experienced. But he's not lost anything. What's happened here? He's not lost anything of his skill, has he? Isn't it just marvelous? Just look at this. The way the ring, or the earring is kind of put in there, if you blot it or cover it over, it takes all the interest out of here. Your eye goes right there, even more so than to the eyes. It's really an interesting trick. And it's one he repeats when we go on here. Let's see to the next one. Here at 53, this guy could be in his 70s or 80s. And what was the ring? The attention getter here, those little strings of hair, just adding some light on the side. But look at this. These are cholesterol collections underneath the skin. Probably. They're actually, they used to be fairly common, right, Elizabeth? Yeah, you don't see them these days, but now because people are much more conscious of what they eat and with medication. But he looks tired. Well, he had good reason to be tired. He was broke. He lost all of his money. There have been several relationships, 2 marriages. His life was a disaster at this point, but it certainly took its toll. But it didn't take its toll on his artistic skill, did it? It's really quite amazing if you look at this in some detail. I mean, now it's blown up, right? So you can actually see what the technique is like. If you really blew this up, you'd wonder, gee, why was the yellow or the ochre kind of added in these places? It looks so funny in there. But if you stand back, it all comes in. It's all absolutely right. So his painterly skills are amazing. He's not cognitively impaired, for sure. Now, we already dealt with that one. Now, on with Oliver Sacks again. Now, this is before he had a melanoma in one eye 10 years before. They treated it successfully, except that he was blind. But every examination, his annuals, and that kind of thing, in that interval, gave him hope, and reasonable hope, after 10 years, that it was okay. And that's the position he is in now. So at nearly 80, with a scattering of medical and surgical problems, none disabling, I feel glad to be alive. I'm glad I'm not dead. Isn't that a wonderful way of putting it? Gee, wow. Sometimes bursts out of me when the weather is perfect. Well, today. I am grateful that I have experienced many things and that I've been able to write a dozen books, to receive innumerable letters, and to enjoy what Nathaniel Hawthorne called an intercourse with the world. It's a lovely way of thinking about relationships with other people and experience. It's a beautiful way of doing it. So and just a little bit more. I feel I should be trying to complete my life, whatever completing a life means. I'm not sure I know what that means. Some of my patients in their 90s and 100s say, no, do this. I have had a full life and now I'm ready to go. Well, anyone who's in the Anglican or Episcopal Church recognizes that more as Lord, now let us know thy servant depart in peace, and that's a song of Simeon. But isn't it a nice way of expressing yourself? It's time to go. For me, this means going to heaven. This means going to heaven rather than hell. Sorry, I entertain no such beliefs. I have no belief in or desire for any post-mortem existence other than in the memories of friends and the hope that some of my books may still speak to people after my death. Well, they continue to do that. I don't know for how long, but anyway, they do. Interesting, Saban, who wrote very movingly about the Sabbath. I'm not going to read it out, but really, and of course, it was brought up in an Orthodox Jewish neighborhood, and thoroughly indoctrinated, if you like, in that, and kicked out once the family found out that he was gay, and wasn't reconciled to that until about 80. Now, just moving on here. Well, within that year, he found out that his melanoma wasn't cured. And it wasn't long before he had metastatic disease in his liver and other organs. And it was long before drugs that we have now, which are sometimes very effective for malignant melanoma. So, unfortunately for him. Well, here brings us to Biden. I've written 3 articles in the last year about senior American politicians, of which he's 2 on him. And what was going on? Well, it was interesting to read that Gray Matters by Theodore Schwartz, a neurosurgeon, because, now this is back in 1988. He had 2 aneurysms, one large one which burst, and an arterial pressure that can rip right into the brain and tear it up. And it also acts as a mass. But it can also, by spreading into the subarachnoid space, interfere with the absorption of cerebrospinal fluid, and it creates enormous pressure. So it's a very dangerous thing. And as I say, the mortality rate, depending on the aneurysm and the flotation, that kind of thing, can be close to 50%. He survived that and did very well, and then they electively treated the other one. But then it raises this question: was there any residual, anything that might have contributed to his cognitive function, if not immediately, then later? Or what else contributed to that performance with the debate with Trump or in the White House? And kind of shrinking away from public meetings, discussions, that kind of thing. And so I think there certainly is a progressive cognitive disorder. What? I'm not quite sure, but for sure. Well, there were a lot of people, as you remember, clamoring for him to step down, and that took some people angry, and this is one of them. And as you might imagine, the Wall Street Journal. And so here's the title: "Not all octogenarians are as feeble as Biden." Well, what are his examples of great escapes? Well, Henry Kissinger. Well, he certainly did continue to produce new books, but not new creative books. And Konrad Adenauer, heaven knows how effective he was as Germany's chancellor. He certainly stepped down at the age of 87, and we know that Churchill, in his second term, for sure had serious cognitive problems, and had multiple strokes, And in wartime, it had at least 2 MIs or maybe more. He certainly wasn't working on all thrusters, and he was in his 80s. But the writer, Richard here, he points out some of the demographic change. In 1950, there were, say, 8 people of working age for every one like us. Now it's 3 and 1, or it might be by the middle of the century, yes.
I'm sorry to interrupt. What's an MI?
Oh, myocardial infarction. Heart attack. Yeah, sorry. Good question. And the U.S., like much of the Western world and even the rest of the world, India is having the same kind of problem, or maybe it's partly a solution for them. But the live births are declining in the United States despite immigration. It brings up interesting questions. If it goes from kind of 1 in 8, us 1 to 8, to kind of 1 in 3, who's doing the work? That's a serious problem right now in Japan. It's becoming a problem in Russia. It's certainly looming for China. And so most productive economies, I'm not calling Russia a productive economy. Well, these are the books I mentioned. I just skipped right through here. I'm not going to say anything more about them. Here's a freebie site, and it's a good one. The nice thing about it is just down the road. This is from McMaster. And there it is, alerts at McMasterOptimalAging.org. So you can catch that later. There's good stuff on that almost every week. And one of the pluses is you find out who's who at Mac, by who's writing this stuff, about who. So that's actually a useful thing for referrals, thinking about referrals. So that's just 1 week as a sample. I mean, every week I kind of check it and see. It's interesting stuff to measure risk reduction. One of the nice things is all the courses are delivered to your inbox.
Wow.
So you don't have to come to a crowded library. And so a good cheapo right down the road, what is it, 52 miles to Muncie. I drove it enough, so I should know. Well, sometimes a visual thing, a picture is worth 1,000 words. This was 2021. This is the climate change year that where the Nobel Prize people, or at least they awarded the Nobel Prize because of the looming crisis with climate change. But here it is in one slide, because there's the last glacial maximum. By the way, just to put that in perspective, they dated modern humans to New Mexico and Arizona to a little more than 20,000 years ago. So they must have come across Alaska and Bering Strait under really extraordinary conditions, if you think about it. But anyway, so here we are, just following, I'm going to walk by here, all the way over to maybe 75 years ago. There's the big spike. One slide says it all. It's beautiful when that happens. So, and then, well, I like this one. I put this one together. You've seen, any of you who have been to my talks in the last year or so are familiar with this slide. And I'm going to walk you through this because it's a little, this is a logarithmic scale. This is looking at various indices of the brain, measured from almost beginning of conception, not quite conception, but anyway, early, before birth, prenatal. And it's a log curve, so here's 20, 40, 60, 100. So it's very compressed at this end, right? But the point is, the peak development of the neocortex, that stuff on the top of our brain, right, that's folded in, is around a year. It reaches its maximum thickness, not its maximum density of neurons and connections yet, but very early. And it's already starting to sink or decline around 6. And other gray matter, deeper gray matter, the basal ganglia, other structures, a little later. But notice all of that stuff is peaking in childhood, early adulthood, and childhood. These are MRI studies. And what was it, 120,000 studies. That's very impressive evidence. Okay. This is ventricular enlargement. Flip that up, God. It's maybe more understandable if it was plotted down this way, and this is atrophy of the brain going down here. This is really ventricular volume, or the opposite of brain volume. Do you understand what I'm saying? So the brain is really beginning to shrink here and steeply shrinking here. And that's beginning in the 30s. That's why I put 2 smudges on this thing, 2 sweet spots. The first one we just went through with the Olympics. Who gets gold medals in timed events, power events, speed events, coordination events, any combination of that past 30? Well, Novak Djokovic. But they're outriders, and no one in their 40s. So peak athletic performance is kind of a function of late teens, mid-late teens, through to maybe early 30s for most sports that are demanding athletically. Power, speed, coordination, and then the sweet spot I put in here is for being president or prime minister. And it's delayed, meaning it starts, I mean, I've made this up, but I don't want a president who's 30 or 35 or something like that, because they don't have enough experience. However clever they might be, they haven't been around a lot. And they haven't learned maybe as much in the way of social skills or political skills that are necessary for an office like that. Yeah. But not much beyond 60 or 65. That's what I think. And this whole election south of the border put shed a light on that. It doesn't mean that people aren't very competent in their 60s and 70s and even 80s. And we know people in our community here who are very clever, deep into their life, into their deep 80s and even 90s. But it's not the rule. It is not the most common thing. So that's the point I want to make here. So I've already said this. What I can't say about it, I've asked some of my friends in this community about the arts, and so I put question marks in there, and after all, we just saw Rembrandt in his 50s, and he's still a master. He may be bereft of money and that kind of thing, but he's still a very skillful artist. And I'll show you some examples of skill in late life in the arts next week. But I don't know how. I'm a scientist. I'm not a person with the arts, so I'm clueless here. And I would guess it would be very hard to measure. But here's the thing. I mean, how do you do something? Do you remember seeing her run down that mad at what was it, kind of 20 miles an hour or whatever it was, and spring up into this thing, and it's in millisecond time frames. And she's kind of got her eyes here focused on something, kind of centered. Wow, how does that happen? I can't even begin to think about it. I was on the Bruce Trail last week, and one of the tougher spots, and I have to say, I went around this thing, and no way I was going that way. And even so, I was beaten up. kind of 2.5 hours later, and I wasn't very graceful. But when I saw younger people coming in, it kind of, little gaggles of them, and they're kind of mid-teens, later teens, early 20s, or the super athletes in their 50s, kind of leaping around like deer, from rock to rock. I thought, well, okay, that's, I'm never going to get to there. I've lost that. And so anyway, well, the first part of, well, we know this. Again, this is a bit of a review, but the earliest part of development is all genetically dictated, right? So they kind of turn into recognizing, imprinting with say, mom, that kind of thing. And you don't have to tell a baby to suck on the breast or bottle. You don't have to tell them to do that. You don't have to tell them to kind of move and wiggle and or swallow. All of those things are innate. But within months, the environment begins to impose itself on them, and they're learning language like crazy. Whatever the language, or languages plural are, depending on who their parents are and the culture is. And they're beginning to adopt cultural norms without ever knowing why. They may never know why. But anyway, so all of that stuff, so that plasticity is happening in the nervous system. A large core of it is genetically dictated, but we know with identical twins, they're not actually identical in their behavior. They are different significantly, maybe not genetically, but they are in their behavior. And so, no surprise, culture imposes itself. And then there's this kind of later phase that I was talking about, with everything kind of going down. There's a rather depressing looking graph, particularly at our age. But this illustrates that, I mean, the brain is going crazy early in the first few years. These are a similar area in the visual cortex at birth, not too many neurons yet. They're kind of dividing, finding their place, and then multiplying like crazy and beginning to make a lot of connections. And then with experience, coming experience, the great winnowing. There's a competitive competition for these contacts. And contacts that are strong or serve a purpose are retained. Those that don't are lost without a trace. So the brain makes many more nerve cells than it will ever use, and it winnows them out. All right, and you can see how concentrated it is. There it is between, say, 2-4 months up to say 10 years. That remodeling. So even though we know a lot more than our 10-year-old grandchild, they have a brand new iPad. And they've got tons of memory, and there's no clutter there. Junk, yeah. And they learn it fast, and they remember it. I remember the eye-opener for me was watching my grandson William. He's now 15 up in Alaska, but at the time he was around 6. And my daughter was making dinner, and he just picked up an iPad and started playing with it. And he figured out, you figure out what turns it on, and then you start to play with your fingers and play with the apps. And eventually he actually found the gaming in there, because they're not afraid. They just keep going. They've got endless patience. They keep going, and that's why they learn so well. You just went to the store and got a new iPad or a new computer, which I did recently. So on we go. So how old is old? Well, I can tell you, you know as well as I do. When I was young, people in their 50s looked old to me, even late 40s. And I don't remember anyone in the family in their 80s. I don't remember a 4-generational family, or even a 3-generational family. 3-generational families are common now, aren't they? Even 4-generational families are common now, despite having babies later. And because people are living longer. And why are they living longer? Well, they're living, for the most part, I mean, I'm looking at the privileged here, including myself. We have more disposable income, access to good foods, advice, that kind of thing. We exchange that information with one another. We can have books to read, even if they're misleading sometimes. And we're motivated. And I mean, my parents never thought of working out. They were kidding. But listen, it's the norm. Just come around to the community center at 6 o'clock in the morning and look at the age group. And I'm the oldest, by the way, I think, at 6 o'clock. Anyway, but there is a cost to living longer. And what's the cost? We run into this concrete barrier of degenerative diseases. Alzheimer's has to be one of them, with the whole family. That until now, we haven't been able to treat effectively. We can fix a lot of cancers. We know people who are on various cancer drugs. They live with cancer now and just have a shot every 4 weeks or 6 weeks or whatever it is, at least for many cancers. And cardiovascular disease, boy, that's a whole different world now with endovascular treatments. Boy, that's really transformed things. So we live longer, but we also run into more problems. And healthcare, if we were south of the border, fortunately, our government pays for it, but south of the border, it's really prohibitively expensive for many people, and therefore not accessible. And we're all tuned into lifestyle changes. And one of these books here, the entire book is about diet. I didn't even recognize most of the foods. I don't know where you would get them. So how old is old? Well, we're getting older. And I've already mentioned this stuff. I like this section because this is, where is he? Maybe it's passing around. The book on aging. Yeah, good. So, Nikki is asking an interesting question here. He's a very knowledgeable guy. He knows a lot about science. He knows a lot of what it takes to do really good work, and what good work looks like. And he poses several questions and has his own answers. Let's see, people who advocate that Americans should work until they are 70 are typically in cushy, remunerative, white-collar jobs that are fun and intellectually engaging. I think that's true. You run into somebody working on the fields, that kind of thing, or driving a truck, they went out at 60. So many academics work well into their 80s. Some claim they are doing the best work of their lives, but the trouble is the evidence says otherwise. And most Nobel Prizes in the sciences, scientists make their best, the biggest breakthroughs when they're young. What's young? And if it happens to be physics, theoretical physics, and even experimental physics, but theoretical physics, 20s, 30s. And mathematics, late teens and 20s. Because they don't depend on you mastering a great body of knowledge before you can do your work. Unlike medicine, where it takes 6 years to get through medicine, or something like that, out of high school. And then if you're a neurosurgeon, add 6 or 7 years to that before you get to be brilliant. And so, um, and so, he makes a series. I've run this past a number of my science colleagues, because it's provocative what he says here. Some senior scientists, they sit there in their white hair and occupy a fairly large lab, and they certainly have people there, and it is a productive lab. But the point is, they aren't the ones that are the productive ones. It is the young ones that they're employing in the lab that are the leading edge of the lab, even if they get the credit for it or share the credit. And and when he says scientists have a different role to play when they're older, they become facilitators, not originals. I think that's true. I do. That rings true for me. It is very rare for an older scientist to break through ground. Well, I can speak with authority now because this year is the 8th Nobel thing. I've gone through 7 years of stuff, and I can tell you it's very uncommon to find that not people get Nobel Prizes at 87, even in the 90s, but the work for which they got the prize was 50 years before or even more. That was certainly true in the climate awards. Every one of those guys was in their 80s, one in their 90s, but the original work had been 50, 60 years before that. So, again, I don't know what to make. This happens with large firms like Google, technical ones, Apple, Microsoft. I mean, Apple has lost its edge. Google is kind of losing its edge a little bit. They're now, I mean, the people who own the company, they're not as old as we are, but they're in their late 40s, 50s. They're not the ones developing the programs or working with AI. They may be the ones investing in it, making the deals, but they're not the ones, these aren't Bill Gates in a basement working with like-minded people 24/7 almost when they're in their late teens at Harvard. There's a big difference between them. Well, what about tenure? Well, unfortunately, some universities many universities have caved in this, and they now allow people to, whatever their age, to continue on. There's no measure of productivity. You become a professor, that's it, you're on. Well, imagine what that does to the productivity of the university or the department. You can't hire any young people. Where's the leading edge anymore? It's not coming from the top. And so unless there's space. So, one study suggested older people, and I can say this because I am 85. I'm not asking any of you your age, but anyway. So, and I can see some of this in myself. That was one of the troubling things in putting this stuff together. A little insight into myself. But older people do less well in tasks requiring problem solving, learning, and speed. Well, I'm certainly not up to my grandchildren on doing stuff, for sure. On novel tasks, novel to them, novel to me. Same thing. So we're equal, supposedly. Well, we don't need that. Well, here, what about the super agers? These are really exceptional people. They're in their 80s or beyond, and they're, as I say, they're very energetic people, very motivated, on the ball, elderly people. We all know people like that. We might have been those people. And are there differences? Well, there are measurable differences. If you look at the size of the hippocampus, which is the main organ for kind of receiving and retrieving memories, and which goes early in Alzheimer's disease, they're larger, and so is the nearby cortex. One common characteristic that people keep driving home, strong social relationships are very important in maintaining cognitive thing. If you think about it, navigating the social landscape It's challenging. Remembering names, remembering stuff about people, keeping track of people, being involved with people, that's a complex thing. And to be alone is to invite trouble. I think we know that. Well, I don't need to repeat all of this. I'll just pick up this. A 10-year study of British civil service workers, this is kind of interesting, revealed that cognitive scores involving memory, reasoning, and verbal fluency declined after 45. Wow. And faster in older people. I like this differentiation. Other studies suggest that crystallized, I like that word crystallized, abilities such as vocabulary. I mean, you learn vocabulary. It's really imprinted there. On your deathbed, your vocabulary is kind of there, for the most part. But there are fluid abilities, like processing speed, that suffer. So I don't think there's any surprise about that. Well, I'm not going to go through all of this stuff. What I am going to do is just, it's very difficult to physiologically study the mammalian brain, never mind the human brain. I mean, if you've got billions of nerve cells, even millions of them, making sense of what they're all doing is very, very difficult. In humans, you can learn a lot from looking at the peripheral nervous system because it has all the same, not the same cells, but similar cells. It has nerve cells, it has nerve fibers that have different conduction velocities, they have receptors, all that kind of thing. So it's worthwhile looking at the peripheral nervous system if you want to actually understand what's happening in the central nervous system. Well, just take the motor side. We've had patients in this area with ALS. Those neurons are up in the upper motor neurons, are up in the neocortex here, in area 4 and 6. And then there are thousands of them distributed through the brain stem and down through the spinal cord here, all these motor neurons. They can be studied, actually, quite well. And here's why. They form a unit. By the way, the only Nobel laureate I was ever really close with was John Eccles. And this is a figure of his of a motor unit. So the common coinage in the peripheral motor system is the motor neuron, that's the central cell body, in the spinal cord or the brain stem. And then all the muscle, it's like a single parent family. One single motor nerve cell supplies, is connected to, exclusively, several hundred muscle fibers. So all of these little white dots in here are muscle fibers supplied by that tiny little motor neuron up in the spinal cord to the same scale. So one of my friends, David Burke at the NIH, gave me that figure. It's a beautiful one because it's from a cat, but it shows the basic unit in the peripheral motor system. And that can be studied really well. We don't need. And one of the things that it reveals is that a motor nerve cell supplies 100 muscle fibers. Let's say that motor nerve cell begins to fail in some way. It doesn't matter how, but it begins to fail. Where does that first become obvious? Well, not at the nerve cell. It happens at the extremity of the nerve fiber, where it makes contact with the muscle fibers or sensory receptors, depending on what we're talking about. So if somebody has a nerve cell problem, theoretically here, and it's a progressive problem, I'm speaking of the peripheral nervous system here, it'll begin in the toes and the feet, and by the time it reaches the mid-shin or the knee, it's in the small muscles of the hand, and then it continues to march up the leg in a length-dependent way, and so up the arm, and then the ventral trunk. and then the face, progressively shorter. So these nerve cells fail. It's the longest ones. It's the ones with the longest processes that fail first. When they lose their connection, so think of them again, the model of single-parent families, they lose their contacts. Well, one beautiful thing is, if other surviving nerve cells are nearby, other single parents, they will adopt those muscle fibers that have lost their contact. So their family gets larger. And it partially masks the loss of the nerve cells. That's why, for example, applied to the nervous system, you can get an odd thing like Parkinson's disease. The substantia nigra is a nucleus in the upper part of the brainstem, the key to Parkinson's disease. By the time somebody gets the earliest symptoms of Parkinson's disease, they've already lost 30 to 50% of the nerve cells in the substantia nigra. You follow what I'm saying here? What I'm saying is that clinical symptoms are kind of late in the play, so to speak, before you kind of know anything about it, before the first symptoms have developed. The disease has already been there, probably for years. That's the important thing to understand, really important to understand, because I'm jumping way ahead now, and say in Alzheimer's disease, we know, and this is a bunch of slides here which we're going to ignore now, if we know that if you look at biomarkers, if you measure, say, amyloid beta, the abnormal form, and tau, those are the two standard proteins, they begin to accumulate in the brain 2 to 3 decades before the earliest symptoms. Okay? By the time somebody has early Alzheimer's disease, they have well-established disease in the brain. If you were going to do anything ideally about these diseases, you would want to intervene very early when those biomarkers actually tell you that this person is going to get the disease. If somebody is so unfortunate as to have autosomal dominant Alzheimer's disease, where they will get Alzheimer's disease 100% of the time, and they show, the biomarkers show that early evidence, well, you've got a really strong case for using whatever drugs are available as early as possible. And why isn't that being done? It's not being done because the current family of monoclonal antibodies designed to kind of sweep beta amyloid out and tau are not benign, meaning if they're given to patients, many of them develop multiple little microbleeds, but some of them are quite significant hemorrhages. If you're somebody like Bill Brown, say 20 years ago, and I have no symptoms of this stuff, how keen am I going to be to go on a drug that might make me ill, significantly ill, put me at risk 20 years before I get the trouble? That's the paradox in the current thing. So I'm leaping ahead here. So yes.
I'm just curious, I have a niece who had early onset Alzheimer's, and
Yeah.
at the time she was 52, had a good syndrome. Does that mean that started in her 30s? Most likely? I don't
Yes, it does. And I'm going to skip ahead here because where's Debbie? We need Debbie. Just going to need Debbie right now. Let me just hold on because I want to show you something. It's actually illustrating.
Don't change.
Oh, okay, good. Okay, good. Well, that's what happens when I threaten to leave. Okay, so we're just skipping a lot of stuff here. which you really don't need to see. Okay. This looks crowded, I know, but these are cognitive tests at the top. This is symptom onset at 0. 10 years before, 20 years before, 30 years before. It's clear for all three of them that the cognitive impairment begins, at least based on these tests, not the clinical stuff, not somebody coming in and complaining about stuff or the clinical examination. But there are some detectable abnormalities a decade or maybe even a decade and a half before. But look at the CSF tau. It's already accumulating here kind of 20 years before. And there's one of them here that's out around 30 years now. Yeah, beta amyloid being deposited in the precuneus of the brain 3 decades before, right? So the point is, by these measurements, stuff is happening in the brain well before the clinical presentation. And the same thing is happening, but on a faster time scale, in ALS, Parkinson's disease, frontotemporal degeneration, you name all these neurodegenerative diseases, they're all on the list. The only differences between them are the proteins, the peculiar proteins identified with them, which means that something is wrong in the DNA at some point, creating the mRNA and therefore the abnormal version of a normal protein. That's what's actually happening. And so this is really my summary here. We're just about out of time here. Development of drugs in clinical trials takes a long time. It's very expensive. Am I sympathetic to companies like Biogen? Yeah, it does. To run one Alzheimer's disease study these days costs almost $1 billion. Almost $1 billion. So they have a lot of money out there, shareholders wanting, yeah. That's why they probably got a great squabble with the NIH and were manipulating physicians on panels to get the drugs approved. We had all this stuff that didn't used to happen, but happens now fairly regularly. And but the principle, the important thing is the principle. These diseases have to be treated early. If you're really going to treat them early and prevent them developing, and that means they have to be safe early. So some people are making the case of using like triple therapy, 3 different drugs at substantially lower levels, dose levels, so safer, but act in slightly different ways. It's the way we got around, HIV, triple therapy, multiple therapy, lower doses, attacking it 2 or 3 different ways, or 4 ways. That's how we got it. That's how we're going to get this. It's not going to happen with one drug, at least with the current crop. There's another issue in here we're going to talk about next week, and that is there are other diseases you've heard about, bovine encephalopathy, bad cow disease, that humans can get. But there's a version of that. Some people, like our Nobel friend here, whoever has it, Betty says, these Alzheimer's disease is actually a form of one of those, in that it behaves like an internal infectious disease, not transmissible to somebody else, but these malformed or misformed proteins that are characteristic of the disease, if they come in contact with a normal version, they convert the normal version to an abnormal version. That's called a prion disease. And and meaning it just naturally spreads in the brain. And you can see how it does it. There are the long cell processes, some of them going many centimeters, even in some cases a meter in the body, but changing, transforming normal proteins into abnormal proteins just by contact. That's what happens in spongiform encephalopathy. Now we're going to come back to this for the next week because it's really very important, because it's going to change how we think about and manage these diseases. So I think...
I'm just going to ask you with anti-inflammatories. If someone takes anti-inflammatories on an extensive basis, do they have any impact on
No.
this process?
No. No. The one of the things about Alzheimer's disease, I'm going to say right now, is that, healthcare scientists are among the most conservative. We're not talking about theoretical physicists here, or even basic chemists here. They got stuck on a theory for Alzheimer's disease, meaning, and the assumption was made, and you can understand why. If you look at the brain, you can see all kinds of these deposits of beta amyloid and tau in the brain. It's not too hard to imagine then, or to postulate, they must be causing the disease. That's like saying that the garbage you put out each week is causing whatever's going wrong with your electrical system or the water system in the home or whatever, something in your home. Or is it just garbage? In other words, drugs that clear the garbage may not be effective for the disease. Do you understand what I'm saying? It's very important because for the last 15 to 20 years in Alzheimer's disease, they've been stuck on that. And very reluctant to move on because so much money has been invested in programs and clinics and that kind of thing. Yeah. I'm almost done talking, so questions, yeah,
I was just wondering about all these grab bag diagnoses, like you have an autoimmune disease.
Yeah.
What does that mean? Does that have anything to do with the change in proteins?
It's a
And
good...
one part
Yeah.
of your body attacking another part.
Yeah. Well, meaning auto, you're attacking yourself and cells. I mean, there are two parts to the immune cell population. Half of it produces antibodies, right? And sometimes it recognizes normal or natural proteins as abnormal proteins and attacks them, autoimmune disease. But it doesn't answer the original question. And the original question would be, well, so how did this get triggered in the first place? What actually happened? Were the proteins actually abnormal? Meaning, I think you mentioned earlier the inflammatory disease, right? We're going to talk about senescent cells, aging cells next week. One of the things about senescent cells is that they may not be multiplying anymore, but they release a lot of inflammatory compounds. And if those inflammatory compounds change proteins, then those proteins may be recognized as abnormal. And the immune system is very good about going after them. And it's one of the reasons why autoimmune diseases are more common, harder to treat, and more severe in the young, because they've got really vigorous, vigilant immune systems. We don't at our age. That's why a lot of diseases are easier, autoimmune diseases are easier to manage in our age group. It's not necessarily a good sign. Yeah.
You mentioned hydrocephalus and how it can be
Yeah.
caused. What was the reason I'm asking is because I was diagnosed with that,
Right.
normal pressure.
Normal pressure hydrocephalus.
Yes, but how can that be caused?
Well, there are many causes for, I mean, in the case, in the case of an aneurysm bleeding, the blood gets into a space, a subarachnoid space, and in that space, the CSF, there's a normal cerebrospinal fluid circulation. It's made, and it also has exit places. If blood is clogging up the exit spaces, then you get too much fluid in the subarachnoid space, and it expands, and the ventricles get larger, and it creates pressure problems. And normal pressure hydrocephalus at speed 1, where the pressure is where there's often no obvious cause like that. There wasn't a previous subarachnoid hemorrhage, there wasn't a previous head injury, they didn't have encephalitis, they didn't have meningitis. Those are all common causes for plugging up this absorption system. But, and it used to be unrecognized, that normal pressure hydrocephalus. And the giveaway was, for some people anyway, is somebody stumbling, unsteady on their feet, and sometimes cognitive decline, and no one can kind of make sense of it. But the clue is, the real clue, is put a lumbar puncture needle in, drain off the spinal fluid, the symptoms go away. And they do it miraculously. You may have to repeat it, or they'll put in a permanent shunt. Yeah. Okay, so we're on to next week. Yeah.
I'm just curious, you mentioned about DNA and Alzheimer's dementia. Does that mean that we're born, some of us, predisposed to develop?
Yes. Yeah, some of us, yeah. I didn't get to that slide. And in fact, I'll just go back to that.
Thank you very much, that was lovely, really informative.
Okay, thank you. Where are we?
What you say?
What did I do with it? I know it's here somewhere. Oh, by the way, just to show you that normal brains aren't normal, these are MRI studies of, could be you and I. And look at this, the prevalence of small vessel disease. 70 to 79, well, I'm here. 25 to 40% of people have, if you look at the MRI, have evidence of one more little stroke. Asymptomatic. Remember, my sister found this about 4 years ago. She had 6 of them, no symptoms. She just had CAT scan done. The point is that it isn't just Alzheimer's, it's also, my wife has Alzheimer's disease, but she also has vascular disease. She has 2 infarcts, and that was an old MRI. Heaven knows what it might show now.
When you say small vessel disease, does that mean arteriosclerosis, atherosclerosis?
That means a small.
Or bleed.
No, they.
It's a very amorphous term.
Not under the microscope, is it? These are small penetrating vessels, tiny little ones, but a lot of them, in the ventral part of the brain, and around the ventricles, and you can actually, that's the trouble when I skip through this stuff. Let's see.
Meaning reduced flow of blood.
Yes, reduced flow. Yeah. These are, sometimes they do bleed. They do bleed, but they're microbleeds. You're not going to get your cerebral hemorrhage from them. And they do occur in association with these monoclonal antibodies treatments for Alzheimer's disease. They do as a consequence of the drug. Yes.
You often hear the expression, you have to exercise the brain.
Yeah,
And
well,
examples of playing chess, playing Sudoku, learning new languages. Are there any studies to verify this?
yeah, it brings up the question of brain training. There are all kinds of Um, I was just up in the Bruce Peninsula with friends, and they play Wordle and a couple of other games every day. And now they happen to enjoy it, but also I know that a lot of people will do those as brain sharpeners, staying sharp. I don't want to put it, I don't do that kind of stuff. Maybe I should be doing that kind of stuff, although doing this kind of stuff is probably my version of that. And truth be known, I do think it's important to stay engaged cognitively. Passive things are not good. Watching television, watching movies, kind of stuff. Stuff that involve you. That's why social things are good, right? Because you're actually with somebody doing something. Now, does that mean I don't watch television? No, I watch it, but I like to have something that it's engagement. Yeah. So the problem with the implication is if you play Wordle every day, your brain will be generally better. Actually, what happens is you get better at Wordle. But it doesn't translate that you're any better at mathematics or anything else. I don't think so. I mean, the evidence doesn't support that, and it is a general effect. But it is a social thing that some people do. Rita and I have a friend in England who, was determined to learn French. Well, that involved learning French with a group. So I think that's one of the most important social activities, but in the process, she's learned to speak French. That's a good thing. That's really a good thing. So, and stuff like that. If you're an inquiring kind of person, if you want to understand stuff, if you're one of these people who want to look stuff up all the time and question stuff, oh, that's a really good thing. What's not good is to be passive. That's not a good thing. And I don't think. Yeah.
Well, one of the sort of something I've been thinking about.
That's why I'm doing what I'm doing.
So a person's young and studying hard for sometimes, in medicine or in physics, and maybe for 10 years, a very, very intense study. And they get a designation, but at that point they know a field fairly well. But as 25 years later, they're going many different, they're not going to continue with that intensity in that field. So they become lab instructors and teachers, and they don't keep up.
They don't keep up, or
Very few people who are well trained here keep up here. And that's, I would think, applies to medicine too.
or they've docs continue to be docs. Docs don't like being chairman of things, and they're kind of loaders in a way. They may be in a department, but they're socially they're often loaders. They want to do their own thing, but in my experience, but unlike engineers, for example, who graduate in engineering, and they practice engineering, what they were taught, for 10 to 15 years. But sooner or later, they get into the management side. And that's seen as progress. And I suppose in a way it is, but they're no longer an engineer.
Not as intense as they were here. When they were 30, they
Yeah.
did this, and when they're 50, they're behind the field. They don't open the journals.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, one of the good things for me, I'm not the object here, but one of the good things for me, say for example with the Nobel Prizes, I don't know who's going to win it. Each year I can guess, and sometimes I'm right 1 in 3 or 1 in 4. But usually, I find out who won it, or whoever the group won it, in early October. Then I have to talk about it in early November. I have to scramble like hell because I can't go to a library. There's a source to tell me a lot about those people. Fortunately, the Nobel Committee does provide really good material. But I think that's a good thing. I think that's a really good thing, the scrambling. And in fact, it's kind of fun. And or putting together a talk like this is a good thing. You've heard me say quote dozens of times. Stephen Weinberg, one of my heroes, not as a person, but for what he says sometimes. And well, he died a year ago, but what he said was, if you ever want to learn something, teach it. So he made it his habit. He was a particle physicist. And got a Nobel Prize. And he said he would go to the faculty or the physics department or the chemistry department and say, give me a course to teach. And he'd start cold, or almost cold. And that's a great way to stimulate the brain. It really is, because you're in new territory. You're doing what your grandson did, something new, something novel. I know it's not novel to the person who invented it or did the study, but it's novel to me, to you. And that's the challenge. That's why it's good. That's why it's good for us, I think. So I think Stephen Weinberg's absolutely right. And sharing stuff like this with a group is a very good thing. I think there's a lot of sloppiness in the field. We'll kind of deal with that as we kind of move along. A lot of bogus stuff. And there's a hell of a lot of stuff we don't know about aging. So hopefully we'll get to that too. But that's not a bad thing. Anything else? No? Oh, that's good. No more questions. Okay, well, thank you.
Thanks very